Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Today, we are jumping into a very specific legal and political paradox from the 17th century.
Right, because we were looking at how a nation actually manages to legally try a monarch for treason. I mean, the entire legal system is written in his name, right?
Exactly. Treason is, by definition, a crime against the sovereign.
Yeah.
The courts operate on his authority. The laws are his laws. So, how does an entire nation invent a legal loophole to put their own king on trial and, well, chop off his head?
It's a massive question. And our sources today help us unpack the era between 1642 and 1651.
Which is basically a decade that saw the total collapse of centralized authority in the British Isles.
Yeah, resulting in severe bloodshed, very radical ideological experimentation, and just a permanent alteration of how political power works. Yeah. Now, most history books refer to this simply as the English Civil War.
Right, but the sources we are looking at for this deep dive firmly reframe this period.
They really do. It was not just an English constitutional crisis. We are looking at the wars of the Three Kingdoms.
Yeah, it's a deeply interconnected, highly volatile series of conflicts involving England, Scotland, and Ireland. Viewing the English Civil War in isolation just fundamentally misunderstands the mechanics of the era.
Because the volatile reactions that tore England apart began in and were constantly fueled by events in the other two kingdoms.
Exactly. The other two kingdoms ruled by the Stuart monarchy. It was a complete chain reaction.
And the stakes for you, the listener, really could not be higher here. This specific period forged the very foundations of parliamentary democracy.
It absolutely destroyed the centuries-old concept of the divine right of kings.
Yeah, and it burst radical concepts of human equality, civil rights, and religious freedom that still dictate how modern governments operate today. Okay, let's unpack this.
To understand the rupture, we really have to understand the power dynamic in place before 1640.
Right, which means looking at King Charles I, who inherited the throne in 1625.
Charles I is, he's the central variable in this crisis. He was a monarch who firmly and genuinely believed in the divine right of kings.
And this wasn't just a political stance for him?
No, not at all. This was a deeply held theological conviction. He believed that he was appointed directly by God to rule, and therefore he was answerable only to God.
So he felt absolutely no obligation to answer to the people?
None, and certainly no obligation to answer to Parliament.
The sources outline how this belief dictated his entire governance style. It makes me think of a modern corporate structure.
Oh, how so?
Like specifically a CEO who inherits a massive, sprawling corporation from their parent. And this CEO believes they own the company completely outright. So they completely ignore the board of directors. They view the board as merely an advisory committee that they can dismiss at will.
Right, just totally bypassing them.
Exactly. They ignore the board entirely until the company is desperate for capital and, they need the board to sign off on a new loan.
That analogy tracks very well with the functional reality of Charles's early reign. In the English system, Parliament held the crucial power of the purse.
They controlled the money.
Right. The monarch needed Parliament to vote on and approve taxation, particularly to fund foreign policies or military campaigns.
But Charles found Parliament to be, obstinate.
Very. They wanted to debate his policies, question his advisors, and leverage their financial power to force political concessions.
And Charles viewed this as an intolerable infringement on his divine authority, right?
Exactly. So he simply stopped calling them. For 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, Charles ruled entirely without Parliament.
Which is known as the personal rule.
Or, by his detractors, the 11 years' tyranny.
But a kingdom still costs money to run. And the sources note that inflation was rising steadily during this period.
It was. The traditional royal revenues, like the lands and feudal dues the king owned directly, were just worth less and less in real terms.
So without Parliament to grant new taxes, Charles had to get creative to fund his government.
And that creativity caused massive friction. He relied on these extra parliamentary taxes, resurrecting obscure medieval laws to fine landowners. But the most infamous of these was ship money.
We really need to explain the mechanics of ship money because it's not just a standard tax. It is the specific way it was collected that made it so explosive.
Yeah, so ship money was actually a traditional legitimate levy placed on coastal counties during times of war.
Okay.
The idea was that these counties provided ships, or the money to build ships, for national defense, since they were the most vulnerable to a naval attack.
But Charles began levying it during peacetime.
He did. And crucially, he extended it to the inland counties as well.
Legally, I guess he justified this by claiming the whole realm benefited from naval protection, so the whole realm should pay.
That was the argument, yeah.
But practically speaking, how did he actually collect this money without, an army of federal tax agents?
Well, he relied on local officials, specifically the county sheriffs. The king issued a writ demanding a certain sum from a county. The sheriff then had to assess the property of everyone in his county and determine how much each household owed.
And if they didn't pay?
If someone refused to pay, the sheriff was legally obligated to confiscate their property or imprison them.
So the king is essentially forcing local elites to extort their own neighbors.
Basically, yes.
That seems like a recipe for destroying the social fabric of local communities. You are turning the local gentry into debt collectors for a tax they themselves view as illegal.
Exactly. It struck at the very heart of English property rights. If the king could arbitrarily decide there was a national emergency,
Right.
levy a tax without parliament, and force local sheriffs to collect it on pain of imprisonment, then private property essentially did not exist.
The king could simply take what he wanted.
Politically, it was viewed as a blatant, tyrannical overreach.
So money was one massive source of friction. But reading through these sources, religion seems even more volatile.
Oh, absolutely. Charles, along with his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, promoted Arminian or Laudian religious practices within the Church of England.
We should probably translate this for a modern listener. What did that actually look and feel like to a person sitting in a pew in, say, 1635?
To understand the friction, we really have to look at the theology.
Okay.
Following the Reformation, the Church of England was broadly Calvinist in its theology, which placed a heavy emphasis on predestination and the absolute sovereignty of God.
The physical churches were often quite plain, right?
Very plain. The focus was on the pulpit and the preaching of the word, but William Laud and the Arminians wanted to shift this focus.
They emphasized the beauty of holiness.
Exactly. They wanted ritual, ceremony, and visual splendor.
So they started bringing back stained glass windows, highly decorated vestments for the clergy, and most controversially, they moved the communion table.
The communion table is the perfect physical representation of this conflict. For decades, the wooden communion table sat in the center of the church, completely accessible to the congregation.
And Laud ordered these tables moved.
Yes, to the east end of the church, elevated on steps, wailed off from the congregation, and he referred to it as an altar.
To the Puritan factions within England, this was deeply alarming. And we should clarify what a Puritan was in this context, because they weren't just people who hated fun.
No, not at all. The Puritans were zealous Protestants who wanted to purify the Church of England of what they saw as the lingering, corrupting remnants of Catholicism.
Right.
They favored plain worship, strict, literal adherence to Scripture, and a significant reduction in the power of bishops.
They believed the individual should have a direct relationship with God, right? Unmediated by elaborate rituals or a strict church hierarchy.
Exactly. So when Charles and Archbishop Laud start enforcing these new ceremonial changes, elevating the altar, enforcing set liturgies, bringing back the visual language of the medieval church,
the Puritans didn't just see a different style of worship.
no, they saw a deliberate, sinister backsliding.
They saw it as a back door to drag their souls back to Rome and eternal damnation.
To a Puritan, a bishop dictating exactly how to pray wasn't just an administrative annoyance. It was a literal barrier between their soul and God.
And those physical altar rails were a physical barrier separating the common believer from the divine.
Exactly. It was viewed as an existential threat to their salvation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the situation was already incredibly precarious just within England.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yeah, it was a powder keg.
You have a king taxing without consent and imposing religious rituals that a vocal segment of the population believes are essentially satanic.
Right.
But Charles was not just the king of England. He was the king of Scotland and the king of Ireland. And this brings us to the multiple kingdoms problem.
Let us extend your earlier corporate analogy here. Charles is not just the CEO of one company.
Right. He's trying to manage a forced corporate merger of 3 completely different companies.
Yes, each with its own intense, deeply ingrained corporate culture, and he is trying to force them all to use the exact same HR department located in London.
Governing a composite monarchy is exceptionally difficult.
The demographics alone are a nightmare to balance. I mean, England was Anglican with a very strong, highly vocal Puritan minority.
It's Scotland.
Scotland was fiercely Presbyterian, having undergone a thoroughly Calvinist reformation from the bottom up, and they deeply resented any English interference.
And then there's Ireland.
Right, Ireland was a majority Catholic nation, but the political and economic power was heavily concentrated in the hands of a Protestant minority ascendancy.
Bolstered by recent English and Scottish settlers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balancing act that requires intense diplomacy, constant compromise, and just a deep, empathetic understanding of each kingdom's unique culture and grievances.
Which Charles did not have.
No, Charles, driven by his inflexible belief in divine right and uniform authority, applied a heavy hand instead. He wanted uniformity across his realms.
And it was on the periphery, in Scotland, where that heavy hand finally struck a spark.
Yes. In 1637, Charles attempted to impose religious uniformity by introducing a new Book of Common Prayer in Scotland.
It was heavily influenced by the English liturgy, right?
It was. And crucially, it was imposed by direct royal decree. He completely bypassed the Scottish Parliament and the General Assembly of the Scottish Church, known as the Kirk.
To the Scots, this was a double insult. It was an imposition of what they viewed as a popish English religion, and it was an assertion of arbitrary royal power that completely ignored their own established political and religious institutions.
The sources provide a very vivid picture of the reaction on the ground.
Yeah, let's talk about that. We were in St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh. It's July 23, 1637.
The dean opens the brand new royally mandated prayer book to read the service.
And a riot breaks out almost instantly.
The accounts describe a chaotic scene. The congregation began shouting, drowning out the dean.
And there's a specific person mentioned in the sources, right?
Yes. A woman named Jenny Geddes is famously documented as picking up the three-legged stool she had brought to sit on and throwing it directly at the dean's head.
Just hurling a piece of furniture at him.
Exactly, shouting a protest against what she perceived as Catholic Mass being forced upon them.
A riot in a church over a prayer book might seem strange to us now, but for a Scottish Presbyterian, the stakes were absolute.
They were. The riot in St. Giles was not an isolated incident. It was the ignition point for a massive, highly organized national uprising.
The Scottish resistance mobilized with incredible speed, didn't they?
Very quickly. By February 1638, thousands of Scots gathered to sign the National Covenant.
This was a solemn, legally binding pledge.
Right, to defend the purity of their Presbyterian religion against these unauthorized innovations. Those who signed it became known as the Covenanters.
And the Covenanters effectively took control of the entire country.
By November of that year, the Glasgow Assembly formally abolished the office of bishop in Scotland entirely.
Which is a massive escalation. I mean, bishops were the king's primary mechanism for controlling the church. By abolishing them, the Scots were directly challenging Charles's royal authority.
And Charles could not let this stand. It was a direct affront to his sovereignty. If he allowed the Scots to dictate their own religion and defy his decrees, his authority in England and Ireland would immediately crumble.
So this escalation leads directly to armed conflict.
Yes. The First and Second Bishops' Wars of 1639 and 1640, Charles attempts to suppress the Covenanters by military force.
But these wars exposed the fatal mechanical weakness of Charles's personal rule. He had no standing army.
Because he had refused to call Parliament for 11 years, he lacked the legal authority and the funds to raise and supply a professional military force.
So who did he send to fight the Scots?
To fight the Scots, Charles had to rely on raw, unpaid, unenthusiastic conscripts drawn from the northern English militias.
That does not sound like a recipe for success.
No, these men were poorly equipped, they lacked discipline, and honestly, many actually sympathized with the Scottish religious grievances.
Whereas the Covenanters, on the other hand, had a highly motivated force.
Very much so. Led by experienced veterans who were returning from the brutal religious wars in continental Europe, most notably General Alexander Leslie.
The tactical details from the sources really highlight this disparity, particularly during the Second Bishops' War at the Battle of Newburn in August 1640.
Right, the English forces are trying to hold a ford across the River Tyne to block the Scottish advance into northern England.
And the Scottish artillery officer, Alexander Hamilton, executed a brilliant piece of tactical improvisation.
He really did. He took his light artillery pieces and actually hoisted them up to the top of a local church tower in Newburn.
I mean, the physical effort required to haul heavy bronze or iron cannons up a narrow stone church tower is staggering.
It's incredible. But the mechanical advantage it gave them was decisive.
It gave the Scottish artillery complete dominance over the English positions on the riverbank below.
Exactly. They had an elevated, fortified firing platform. Under a concentrated, plunging bombardment, the raw English conscripts simply panicked.
They broke formation and fled the field.
The victory at Newburn was technically a tactical skirmish, but the strategic outcome was devastating for Charles. It allowed the Covenanter army to march in and occupy the vital coal port of Newcastle.
And Newcastle was the primary supplier of coal to London. By holding it, the Scots had their hands firmly on the economic throat of the English capital.
And as winter approached, London needed that coal. The Scots had immense leverage.
And simultaneously, an even more violent crisis erupts in the Third Kingdom. The sources detail the outbreak of the Irish Rebellion in October 1641.
To understand the eruption in 1641, we have to examine the mechanics of the deep-seated, long-standing tensions in Ireland.
Right, primarily stemming from the policy known as the Plantation of Ulster. Let's explain how a plantation actually functioned in this context.
Sure. In the early decades of the 17th century, following a previous rebellion, the English crown confiscated vast swaths of land from the native Gaelic Irish Catholic lords in the northern province of Ulster.
And this land was not just taken.
No, it was systematically cleared and then given to Protestant settlers brought over from England and Scotland.
So the native Catholic majority, representing roughly 80% of the overall population in Ireland, was systematically marginalized.
They lost their land, their political representation, and faced heavy penal laws restricting their religious practices.
Power was concentrated in the hands of a small Protestant ascendancy.
Furthermore, Charles's Lord Deputy in Ireland, Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, had spent the 1630s aggressively pushing for even more land confiscations to increase royal revenues.
And Strafford's heavy-handed administration alienated basically everyone.
Everyone. The native Irish, the new Protestant settlers, and the old English Catholics who had lived in Ireland for centuries but remained loyal to Rome.
So when the rebellion broke out in October 1641, the sources indicate it was initially led by a small group of Irish Catholic elites.
Yes, their goals were quite specific. They wanted to secure their land titles, achieve religious toleration, and preempt a feared invasion by anti-Catholic forces.
From the newly empowered English Parliament or the Scottish Covenanters.
Right. The political situation in London and Edinburgh terrified the Irish Catholics. The Puritans and Presbyterians were fiercely anti-Catholic.
The Irish leaders realized that if Parliament gained control of the king, severe anti-Catholic persecution would inevitably follow in Ireland.
So they rebelled to secure their position while Charles was distracted.
But the primary sources document that the rebellion quickly spread beyond the control of its initial leaders.
It did. In the ensuing chaos, massacres of Protestant settlers were committed by the insurgents. Thousands of settlers were driven from their homes as winter approached, leading to mass exposure and starvation.
We should be clear that we are just recording what is in the sources here, not taking sides. The accounts from the period describe localized, highly brutal violence. Settlements were attacked, homes burned, and civilians killed.
And tales of this violence, heavily embellished and highly exaggerated by the pamphlet presses, flooded back to England.
The printing press plays a massive role here, doesn't it?
Huge. It created an atmosphere of absolute visceral panic and intense anti-Catholic hysteria in London. Pamphlets featured gruesome woodcuts depicting torture and slaughter.
And the documented violence perpetrated against Protestant civilians during the initial uprising profoundly inflamed the political climate.
It created an immediate, desperate consensus in London. Military intervention was required to quell the rebellion in Ireland.
Wait, I need to pause you here. Charles is trying to control Scotland, and now Ireland explodes in mass violence. How could a king who firmly believes God is on his side justify completely losing control of two of his three kingdoms at the exact same time?
It's a fair question.
And more importantly, how did a war in Scotland and a rebellion in Ireland force a civil war in England? Charles still sits on the throne in London.
It comes down to a complete financial and political trap, driven by the mechanical realities of 17th century warfare.
Okay, it's laid out for us.
Let us look at the aftermath of the Scottish occupation of Newcastle. To halt the Scottish advance and regain the coal supply for London, Charles was forced to sign the Treaty of Ripon.
And the terms of that treaty were entirely dictated by the Scots.
They were. As part of the terms, Charles agreed to pay the occupying Scottish Covenanter army £850 every single day to cover their expenses until a final peace settlement could be negotiated.
£850 a day in 1640 currency is an astronomical, paralyzing sum.
Exactly. Charles was completely, irrevocably bankrupt. He had absolutely no choice.
He could not raise that kind of capital through obscure taxes or local sheriffs.
No, he had to do the one thing he had actively avoided for 11 years. He had to recall the English Parliament to secure the national taxation required to pay off the Scots and get them out of northern England.
And this Parliament, which convened in November 1640, is known to history as the Long Parliament.
Because it would legally not be dissolved for decades.
And the Long Parliament arrived in Westminster with an 11-year backlog of grievances.
They were acutely aware of the king's desperate financial position, and they intended to leverage it to dismantle his absolute monarchy piece by piece.
This is where we reach the point of no return. The legislative standoff between Charles and the Long Parliament was swift, comprehensive, and brutal.
Parliament immediately passed laws ensuring their own survival. They passed the Triennial Act, mandating that Parliament must meet at least every 3 years, regardless of whether they called them.
They passed legislation preventing the king from dissolving Parliament without their own consent.
They abolished the prerogative courts, like the Star Chamber, which Charles had used to bypass the common law and enforce his will.
They declared ship money illegal. They were systematically dismantling the machinery of the personal rule.
They also presented Charles with the Grand Remonstrance in late 1641.
This was a massive, highly publicized document detailing over 200 specific grievances regarding his reign.
Yes, blaming his policies on a malignant Catholic conspiracy surrounding the throne.
But the sources show they went further than just listing complaints or securing their own sitting. In 1642, Parliament issued the 19 propositions.
When you read the actual text of these demands, they are incredibly radical for the 17th century.
They really are.
They represent a total shift from a legislative body advising a monarch to a legislative body demanding executive control.
The 19 propositions sought to force the king to place all his ministers, his military commanders, and even the education and marriage of his children under the direct supervision and approval of Parliament.
They demanded oversight of foreign policy. They were essentially stripping the crown of its executive function and reducing the king to a figurehead.
And Charles rejected them outright,
famously stating that if he agreed, he would be but a mere phantom of a king.
But the crisis over the military is what finally snapped the political bonds.
This ties back directly to the Irish Rebellion. The panic in London meant an army had to be raised to suppress the Catholic insurgency in Ireland.
But who would command this new army? Traditionally, the king commands the armed forces. That is the core function of a monarch.
But Parliament profoundly distrusted Charles. They feared that if they authorized the taxation to allow Charles to raise and equip a massive professional military force, he would not send it to Ireland.
They feared he would immediately turn that same army around, march on Westminster, and use it to permanently crush Parliament.
So Parliament took an unprecedented step. They passed the Militia Ordinance, claiming the legal right to appoint military commanders and raise troops without the king's royal assent.
Charles obviously refused to accept this unconstitutional seizure of his core military authority.
He responded by issuing his own traditional commissions of array, ordering the local nobility to raise militias in his name.
The legal debate had fractured. The central authority of the state had completely bifurcated.
Both the king and Parliament were now actively sending competing orders to the counties, actively trying to gain physical control of the country's armed militias and magazines.
And in January 1642, Charles made a catastrophic political and tactical miscalculation that pushed the crisis into open violence.
Convinced that radical members of Parliament were actively colluding with the invading Scots and fueling the unrest in London, Charles decided to cut the head off the opposition.
So Charles personally entered the House of Commons. He brought an armed guard of soldiers to the doors of the chamber, walked in, and demanded the arrest of 5 leading members of Parliament, including prominent figures like John Pym and John Hampden, on charges of high treason.
It was an unprecedented, shocking breach of parliamentary privilege, the monarch physically bringing armed men into the legislative chamber to arrest elected representatives.
But the execution of the plan was a disaster. The element of surprise was lost.
The 5 MPs had been tipped off and had already fled the chamber, escaping down the river.
The sources record Charles looking around the silent room and famously stating, "I see the birds have flown. when he realized his targets were gone.
That single action destroyed any remaining trust. The local populace in London became violently hostile to the king.
The city mobilized its trained bands to protect Parliament, fearing an imminent military coup.
Charles recognized that he had entirely lost control of his own capital. Fearing for his physical safety and the safety of his family, he fled London and moved north to rally his supporters.
The political and legal debate was officially over. The transition from debate to armed conflict becomes official on August 22, 1642.
Charles arrives at Nottingham Castle. He raises the massive royal standard.
By doing this, he formally calls all loyal subjects to his side to put down what he views as an armed, treasonous rebellion by Parliament.
The First English Civil War had begun. The nation was now forced to take sides. It divided families, towns, and counties.
Broadly speaking, the Royalists, often nicknamed Cavaliers, drew significant support from the traditional aristocracy, conservative landowners, and the regions in the north and west of England, as well as Wales.
The Parliamentarians, derisively called Roundheads by their opponents because of the short haircuts favored by many London apprentices, were strong in the south, the eastern counties, the navy.
And crucially, they controlled the immense wealth, port facilities, and resources of the City of London.
By October 1642, both sides had managed to assemble field armies of roughly 20,000 men each, and they met in the first major pitched battle of the war at Edge Hill in Warwickshire.
We need to spend some time on Edge Hill, because to understand the Civil War, you have to understand the brutal mechanical reality of 17th century warfare.
Very true.
The Royalists held a strong topographical position on a ridge. Their forces were commanded in part by the king's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine,
who was a highly experienced and fiercely aggressive cavalry commander.
The battle commenced with devastating Royalist cavalry charges on both wings. Prince Rupert's horsemen, utilizing the tactic of charging at a full gallop and firing their pistols at the last possible second before drawing swords, absolutely shattered the less experienced Parliamentarian cavalry facing them.
The Parliamentarian horse broke and fled from the field.
But while the cavalry is fighting on the wings, the massive infantry formations are grinding into each other in the center. The sources describe these formations as tercios. How did a tercio actually operate on the battlefield?
A tercio was a dense, highly structured formation. The center consisted of a massive block of pikemen.
Yeah.
These men wielded ash pikes that were 16 to 18 feet long. They were essentially a mobile wall of spear points. Flanking this central block of pikemen were sleeves of musketeers.
Why combine them like that? Why not just have all muskets since they have range?
Because of the reload time, a 17th century matchlock musket was a heavy, cumbersome weapon. It required pouring loose powder down the barrel, ramming home a lead ball, and igniting it with a smoldering piece of slow match.
That sounds slow.
It was. A trained musketeer might manage one shot a minute. While they were reloading, they were completely defenseless against a cavalry charge.
So the pikemen existed to protect the musketeers.
Exactly. If cavalry approached, the musketeers would retreat under the protection of the 16-foot pikes, which horses would not charge into.
So at Edge Hill, Rupert's cavalry shatters the Parliamentarian wings. The Parliamentarian infantry is exposed. This should be a total Royalist victory.
It should have been. But this is where the lack of discipline that plagued early Civil War armies changed the outcome.
What happened?
Instead of wheeling their horses around and attacking the exposed flanks of the Parliamentarian infantry, Prince Rupert's cavalry lost control.
They just kept going.
They pursued the fleeing enemy cavalry for miles off the battlefield, straight into the Parliamentarian baggage train, where they began looting.
Because the Royalist cavalry vanished to plunder the baggage, the Parliamentarian infantry held their nerve. They engaged the Royalist infantry in a grinding, brutal push of pike, where the opposing blocks of spearmen literally shoved against each other in the mud.
The battle ended as a bloody tactical draw. Neither side broke the other.
Charles continued his advance toward London following Edge Hill, but his progress was slow.
He was eventually blocked at Turnham Green by a massive, hastily assembled Parliamentarian militia force that outnumbered him 2-1.
Refusing to risk the destruction of his only field army, Charles withdrew. He established his wartime capital in the heavily fortified university city of Oxford, where he would remain for the rest of the war.
The war settled into a grueling, highly destructive regional conflict. 1643 saw a string of Royalist successes.
They won the Battle of Edwalton Moor, giving them control of the industrial wealth of Yorkshire.
And Prince Rupert successfully stormed and captured the vital port city of Bristol in the southwest.
Parliament realized their current strategy was failing. They needed a massive injection of manpower, and they looked north for an ally.
In 1644, Parliament negotiates a treaty known as the Solemn League and Covenant with the Scottish Covenanters.
The Covenanters are back, but what is the price for their military support?
The price was theological. In exchange for sending a massive veteran army south into England to fight the king, Parliament agreed to reform the English religion along strict Presbyterian lines.
This Scottish intervention fundamentally altered the balance of power, leading directly to the Battle of Marston Moor in July 1644. It was the largest battle of the entire war, involving over 40,000 men.
An allied force of English parliamentarians and Scottish Covenanters decisively crushed the Royalist Northern Army. The Royalist infantry was largely destroyed, and they lost massive amounts of ordnance.
This battle permanently broke Royalist power in the north of England.
But despite the massive victory at Marston Moor, Parliament's armies in the south were still struggling.
They were suffering defeats, lacking coordination, and dealing with mutinies over lack of pay.
They realized their entire military structure was fundamentally flawed. It relied on regional militias who refused to march outside their home counties, and commanders who were chosen for their aristocratic rank rather than their tactical skill.
So in 1645, Parliament passes legislation to create the new model army.
The new model army is a watershed moment in British military history. It was the establishment of a professional, standing, national military force.
But armies had existed before. What made the new model army mechanically and functionally different from the traditional armies raised by Charles, or even the earlier parliamentarian forces?
Three critical factors drastically changed the operational capacity of this force. First, funding and structure. It was centrally funded by regular national taxation, specifically the monthly assessment.
This meant soldiers were actually paid regularly, which vastly reduced desertion, minimized the need to plunder local civilians for food, and drastically improved morale.
Second, Parliament passed a radical piece of legislation called the Self-Denying Ordinance.
Yes. The Self-Denying Ordinance required all members of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords to resign their military commissions.
Leadership was now based on military competence and battlefield experience, not political or social status.
Sir Thomas Fairfax, a highly competent tactician, was appointed commander-in-chief.
Oliver Cromwell, who had proven his brilliant aggression as a cavalry commander at Marston Moor, was given an exemption to remain in Parliament and was eventually appointed to lead the horse.
And third, there is the ideological component. The sources note that the new model army, particularly Cromwell's cavalry units known as the Ironsides, was characterized by intense religious zeal.
They were highly disciplined, strictly Puritan, and they held prayer meetings and sang psalms before battle.
They believed fervently that they were fighting a holy war as God's chosen instrument against tyranny and popery.
This gave them an ideological cohesion that the Royalist forces simply could not match.
This combination of professional discipline, regular pay, meritocratic leadership, and religious fervor made them an incredibly formidable force. And they proved it almost immediately at the Battle of Naseby in June 1645.
Naseby was the decisive turning point of the First Civil War. The new model army engaged the main Royalist field army under the personal command of Charles and Prince Rupert.
And we see the exact same tactical scenario play out as Edge Hill, but with a different result regarding discipline.
Precisely. Once again, Rupert's cavalry charged with incredible violence, broke the opposing parliamentarian wing, and pursued them off the field toward the baggage train.
But on the other wing, Oliver Cromwell's cavalry charged and broke the Royalist horse facing them.
Crucially, Cromwell maintained strict control over his men. He did not let them pursue. He halted them, reformed their lines, and then wheeled them around to charge directly into the exposed flank and rear of the Royalist infantry in the center.
The Royalist infantry was systematically destroyed or captured en masse, along with the king's artillery and his baggage train. But the most damaging loss for Charles wasn't the men. It was the paperwork.
Parliament captured the king's private cabinet containing his personal correspondence. These letters were a political bombshell.
They revealed that Charles was actively negotiating to bring foreign Catholic troops from Ireland and from the continent into England to slaughter his own subjects.
Publishing those letters was a propaganda masterstroke by Parliament. It completely ruined Charles's reputation.
It proved to the public that his claims of defending the Protestant religion were lies, and it alienated any moderate support he had left.
His military forces were systematically ground down over the next year as the new model army captured remaining Royalist strongholds.
Finally, recognizing total military defeat, Charles disguised himself, slipped out of Oxford, and surrendered. But he didn't surrender to Parliament. He surrendered to the Scottish army at Southwell in May 1646. The First Civil War was over.
But the military victory only opened a Pandora's box of incredibly complex political and social questions. The old order had been violently overthrown.
Now Parliament, the Scottish Covenanters, and the new model army had to figure out what was going to replace it. And they all had drastically different visions for the future.
So Parliament has the king in custody. They won the war, but now they have a terrifying logistical problem. They have a massive, heavily armed, highly radicalized standing army camped just outside London, and they have no money left to pay them the massive arrears they are owed.
The army realized that they held the balance of physical power in the nation. Parliament attempted to disband regiments without pay or ship them off to fight in Ireland. The soldiers refused.
They elected representatives known as agitators, and the army effectively became a sovereign political entity. This unpaid, angry army instantly became a pressure cooker for radical democratic thought.
This brings us to a period of incredible intellectual ferment between 1647 and 1649. This is where we see the emergence of the Levelers.
The Levelers were a political movement with massive support within the rank and file of the new model army and among the artisans and tradesmen of London. Their demands were laid out in a series of highly influential manifestos, most notably an agreement of the people.
When you read the Leveler manifestos today, their platform sounds incredibly modern. They were calling for a secular republic.
They wanted to abolish the House of Lords entirely. They demanded equality before the law, freedom of speech, absolute freedom of religion, and, crucially, a massive expansion of the right to vote.
They were challenging the fundamental, centuries-old basis of political power. In the 17th century, political representation was tied almost exclusively to property ownership.
The logic was that only those who owned a significant stake in the land had the right to make laws governing that land.
The Levelers argued a completely different philosophy, that political legitimacy comes directly from the consent of the individuals living in a society, regardless of their wealth.
The clash between these radical democratic ideas and the conservative leadership of the army came to a head at the Putney debates. We have to reconstruct this scene because it is one of the most important ideological clashes in political history.
It is late October and early November, 1647. We are in the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Putney, just outside London.
Gathered around a large communion table are the grandees of the army, the senior commanders like Oliver Cromwell and his highly intellectual son-in-law, Commissary General Henry Ireton.
Sitting face to face with them are the elected representatives of the common soldiers, the agitators, alongside Levelers' civilian spokesmen.
And we know exactly what they said because we actually have the transcripts of these debates taken down in shorthand by a secretary.
The central ideological clash is between Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, speaking for the Levelers, and Henry Ireton, defending the traditional propertied order.
Rainsborough delivers one of the most famous defenses of universal suffrage ever recorded. He passionately argues, "For really I think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live, as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government."
It is a direct demand for universal male suffrage, a radical assertion that mere existence grants political rights. But Ireton pushes back hard. And as harsh as Ireton sounds to our modern democratic ears, from a 17th century perspective, wasn't he defending a completely logical viewpoint?
Ireton articulates the foundational fear of the propertied classes. He argues that if you give men without property the right to vote, they will inevitably use that legislative power to vote away the property of the rich.
Ireton insists that only those with a permanent fixed interest in this kingdom, meaning those who own freehold land or major trading interests, should have the right to choose the lawmakers because they are the only ones who suffer the consequences of bad laws.
He essentially argues that if you have no economic stake, you have no risk, and therefore you shouldn't have a voice. It's hard to judge him purely by 21st century standards. He is terrified that political equality will lead immediately to economic anarchy and wealth redistribution.
The Putney debates did not result in a Leveler victory. The senior officers, alarmed by the radicalism, eventually shut down the debates.
Cromwell restored strict military discipline, eventually crushing Leveller mutinies when they flared up in the ranks.
But the concepts debated in that church, the nature of inherent liberty, representation, and the social contract, foreshadowed the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, including the foundations of the American Constitution.
This raises an important question regarding how these debates actually spilled over into other areas. While the Levellers focused on political rights, another group pushed the radicalism even further into the economic sphere, confirming Henry Ireton's exact fears.
These were the Diggers, or as they call themselves, the true Levellers.
The Diggers were a much smaller movement led by a man named Gerard Winstanley. If the Levellers wanted to reform the Constitution, the Diggers wanted to completely upend the economic structure of society.
Winstanley argued a radical theology, that the earth was created by God to be a common treasury for all people to share, not to be enclosed, fenced off, and owned by a wealthy few.
In April 1649, Winstanley and a small group of followers actually put this into physical practice. They marched onto common wasteland at St. George's Hill in Surrey and simply started digging.
They planted parsnips, carrots, and beans. They established a community where they lived and worked communally, explicitly rejecting private property, wage labor, and the concept of landlords.
In their manifesto, the True Levellers Standard advanced, they declared that the act of buying and selling land was the root of all oppression and war. It is a remarkable early articulation of agrarian communism or proto-socialism.
Put yourself in the boots of a local landowner watching this happen. The Digger communes were small, but the precedent was terrifying. They were quickly harassed, their crops were destroyed, and they were physically dispersed by legal actions brought by the local gentry.
They posed no military threat, but their existence highlights the immense social upheaval of the era.
Like modern grassroots social movements, times of profound national upheaval. When the normal rules of society are suspended, inevitably open the floodgates for ideas that challenge the very fabric of how a society operates.
While these intense ideological debates were happening within the army and the countryside, Charles I was not sitting idly by.
The king was in custody, eventually held under guard on the Isle of Wight, but he was actively plotting. He recognized that his enemies, the English Parliament, the New Model Army, and the Scottish Covenanters, were deeply divided over what the post-war settlement should look like.
Charles attempted to exploit those divisions. In late 1647, he signed a secret treaty with a moderate, royalist-leaning faction of the Scottish Covenanters, known as the Engagers.
In this treaty, Charles made a cynical compromise. He promised to impose Presbyterianism in England for a trial period of 3 years, if the Scots would provide a massive army to invade England, crush the New Model Army, and restore his absolute authority.
This duplicity ignited the Second English Civil War in 1648. The Scottish Engager army invaded northern England, coordinating with a series of localized royalist uprisings that broke out across the country, fueled by resentment against heavy parliamentary taxation and the continued existence of the standing army.
But the New Model Army was simply too efficient and too experienced. Despite dealing with political unrest in their own ranks, commanders like Fairfax and Cromwell moved with brutal speed and precision.
Cromwell marched north and decisively crushed the much larger Scottish invasion force at the Battle of Preston in August 1648 in a running multi-day battle in the rain.
The isolated Royalist uprisings in Wales and Essex were systematically and violently stamped out by Fairfax.
The Second Civil War changed the army's view of the king permanently. During the First Civil War, they fought to force Charles to accept constitutional limitations on his power.
But after he deliberately sparked a second war, plunging the country back into immense bloodshed while pretending to negotiate in good faith, the psychological shift was absolute.
The army leadership, steeped in intense Puritan theology, concluded that Charles was a man of blood. They believed that God had judged Charles through the outcome of the battles.
To negotiate with him further was to defy God's providence. They decided there could be no lasting peace as long as he remained alive and on the throne.
But the majority of the Long Parliament sitting in London, primarily the more moderate Presbyterian members, still shrank from the unprecedented idea of removing the king entirely.
They wanted to continue negotiating with Charles, seeking some form of compromise settlement. The New Model Army realized that Parliament was going to undo everything they had fought and bled for.
This leads directly to one of the most dramatic physical confrontations of the entire period, Pride's Purge.
The mechanics of this event are staggering. Picture the scene. It is the freezing morning of December 6, 1648. Members of Parliament are arriving at Westminster to enter the House of Commons.
But blocking the physical entrance to the chamber is Colonel Thomas Pride, an officer of the new model army, standing with a large detachment of heavily armed soldiers.
Pride holds a list of names. As the elected MPs approach the door, he checks their faces against the list.
If an MP was deemed hostile to the army's goals, meaning they favored continued negotiations with the King Pride's soldiers, physically barred them from entering the chamber.
Over 140 moderate and Presbyterian MPs were turned away or actively arrested and locked in a basement.
The remaining members, perhaps only around 80 active individuals who were sympathetic to the army and the radical independent faction, were allowed to take their seats. This drastically reduced assembly became known as the Rump Parliament.
It was essentially a military coup, executed without a shot being fired, ensuring the legislature would do exactly what the military demanded. And what the military demanded was unprecedented justice against the sovereign.
In January 1649, the Rump Parliament took the legally mind-bending step of passing an act to create a High Court of Justice to try King Charles I for high treason.
We mentioned this at the beginning. How do you legally try the monarch? The courts operate on his authority. Treason is a crime against him.
The prosecution, led by a lawyer named John Cook, had to invent a revolutionary legal concept out of thin air. They argued that the king was not the embodiment of the law, nor was he appointed by God.
They argued he was an officer, entrusted with power by the people of England through a social contract. By waging war against his own subjects and his own parliament, Charles had broken that sacred trust and committed treason against the people of England.
Charles refused to recognize the authority of the court. When he was brought into Westminster Hall, he refused to take off his hat, a profound sign of disrespect for the proceedings.
He rightly pointed out that it was an illegal extrajudicial tribunal created by a purged parliament backed entirely by military force. He demanded to know by what legal authority he was brought there.
But the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The army demanded his death. The court found Charles guilty of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. 59 commissioners, who would later be known as the regicides, signed his death warrant.
On the freezing afternoon of January 30, 1649, Charles I was led onto a black-draped scaffold erected outside the banqueting house of the Palace of Whitehall in London. Before a large, hushed crowd, he was beheaded with a single stroke of the axe.
The shock of this event reverberated across Europe. The public execution of a reigning monarch by his own people was unthinkable. It was followed immediately by a profound constitutional earthquake.
In the weeks that followed, the Rump Parliament passed acts officially abolishing the office of the monarchy entirely, declaring it unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous to the liberty, safety, and public interest of the people. They also formally abolished the House of Lords.
England was declared a Commonwealth and a free state. Sovereignty was formally vested solely in the representatives of the people in the House of Commons, though the practical reality was that power rested with the Council of State and the leadership of the new model army.
The idea of the divine right of kings was irrevocably destroyed on that scaffold.
But removing the king did not bring peace. In fact, it immediately triggered the Third Civil War, pulling Ireland and Scotland forcefully back into the vortex.
Let's look at the Irish theater first, in 1649. Following the execution of Charles I, the Royalists in Ireland formed a broad military coalition with the Catholic Confederates. This presented a massive strategic threat to the new English Republic. They feared an invasion from Ireland.
Parliament appointed Oliver Cromwell as Lord Lieutenant to lead a massive expeditionary force to completely pacify Ireland and eliminate Royalist control. Cromwell arrived with the veteran New Model Army in August 1649.
What follows is one of the most brutal military campaigns in British history. The sources specifically document the sieges of Drogheda and Wexford. It is important to relay this impartially based on the provided text, without moralizing.
The accounts from Drogheda are some of the most harrowing in the archive. The heavily fortified Royalist garrison refused Cromwell's summons to surrender. When Cromwell's artillery breached the walls and his forces stormed the town, he explicitly ordered that no quarter be given to the defenders.
According to the letters sent back to London, Cromwell's troops engaged in the widespread slaughter of the garrison troops, Catholic priests, and civilians within the town.
A similarly brutal massacre occurred at Wexford shortly after, when the town fell to an assault and the discipline of the besieging troops collapsed.
Cromwell justified these actions in his dispatches by claiming it was a righteous judgment upon the Catholics for the massacres of Protestants back in 1641. He also argued the grim military logic that such severe brutality would terrorize other garrisons into surrendering quickly without a fight, thereby preventing further bloodshed in a long, drawn-out campaign.
Regardless of his justifications, the documented slaughters at Drogheda and Wexford left a legacy of deep, enduring trauma and bitterness.
Having broken the back of organized Royalist resistance in Ireland through overwhelming force, Cromwell was hastily recalled to England in 1650 because a massive new threat had emerged in Scotland.
The Scottish Covenanters were absolutely horrified by the execution of Charles I. They had allied with Parliament to limit the king's power, not to kill him and abolish the monarchy. In response, the Scottish Parliament immediately proclaimed his son as King Charles II.
In return for their military support to reclaim his throne, Charles II reluctantly agreed to sign the covenant, promising to impose Presbyterianism across all three kingdoms. This meant Scotland was now officially backing a royalist restoration with a massive field army.
Recognizing the imminent danger of a Scottish invasion, Cromwell launched a preemptive strike. He marched the new model army north into Scotland in the summer of 1650. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Dunbar in September.
Dunbar showcases Cromwell's tactical brilliance under extreme pressure. The Scottish army had masterfully outmaneuvered him, cornering Cromwell's sick and starving forces against the sea with no line of retreat.
But through a devastating surprise attack at dawn, Cromwell's outnumbered army completely shattered the Scottish right wing and routed their entire force.
Despite the total disaster at Dunbar, the Scots managed to formally crown Charles II at Scone. A year later, in 1651, Charles II led a desperate rapid invasion of England, hoping to rally English royalists to his cause as he marched south.
But the English royalists were exhausted, heavily fined, and thoroughly suppressed. Very few rose to join him. Cromwell pursued Charles's army and finally cornered them at the Battle of Worcester on September 3, 1651.
It was an utter, overwhelming defeat for the Royalist and Scottish forces. Charles II barely escaped capture, famously hiding in an oak tree to evade Parliamentarian patrols before fleeing into a long exile in France. The Third Civil War was decisively over.
The military victories in Ireland and Scotland meant that for the first time in history, all three kingdoms were united under a single government in London, ruled by the English Commonwealth. But the domestic political situation in England remained deeply unstable.
The Rump Parliament was still in power, but it was widely seen by the military as corrupt, legally dubious, and overly conservative. Finally, in 1653, Cromwell's frustration with their slow pace of reform boiled over.
He entered the House of Commons with a file of musketeers and forcibly dissolved the Rump Parliament, famously shouting at them, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go."
Following the failure of a subsequent, short-lived nominated assembly known as Barebones Parliament, a new written constitution was drafted by the army officers, known as the Instrument of Government.
Under this constitution, Oliver Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland in December 1653.
He was essentially a king in all but name. He wielded massive executive power, backed entirely by the military. The Protectorate era is fascinating because of the constant, unresolvable tension between Cromwell's attempts to establish a stable civilian government based on Parliament and his ultimate practical reliance on the army to maintain control.
When a series of royalist plots threatened the regime in 1655, Cromwell abandoned civilian administration and divided England into military districts, each ruled by a major general.
The rule of the major generals was highly unpopular. They were tasked not just with security and raising militia taxes, but with enforcing strict Puritan moral reforms at the local level.
The sources detail how they aggressively banned popular pastimes like bear baiting, shut down theaters, closed alehouses, banned sports on the Sabbath, and famously attempted to enforce the ban on the celebration of Christmas, viewing the holiday as a pagan and Catholic superstition.
What's fascinating here is how the military dictatorship left an abiding mistrust of standing armies in British political culture. It ingrained a firm belief that the military must always be strictly subordinate to civilian control.
Cromwell struggled constantly to reconcile his desire for constitutional legitimacy with the reality that his power rested on the bayonets of the new model army. He actually refused the formal offer of the crown in 1657, fearing the army's reaction, but he accepted a revised constitution that allowed him to name his successor.
Oliver Cromwell died in September 1658, symbolically on the anniversary of his great military victories at Dunbar and Worcester. He was succeeded as Lord Protector by his eldest surviving son, Richard Cromwell.
But Richard possessed none of his father's immense military authority or political skill. He completely lost the support of the army grandees. Within 8 months, he was forced by the military to abdicate. The Protectorate collapsed rapidly into political chaos, with various military factions vying for control and threatening a return to civil war.
Fearing a descent into absolute anarchy, a powerful, pragmatic military commander stationed in Scotland, General George Monk, decided to act. He marched his highly disciplined veteran army south to London in early 1660.
Monk recognized that the political experiments had failed. The only way to restore stability, secure pay for the army, and establish a legitimate government was to bring back the traditional monarchy.
Under Monk's protection, a newly elected convention parliament opened secret negotiations with Charles II, who was still in exile in the Netherlands. Charles issued the Declaration of Breda. This was a masterstroke of political compromise.
He promised religious toleration, a general pardon for past actions, and crucially the payment of the army's massive arrears.
Parliament eagerly accepted the terms. In May 1660, King Charles II returned to London in triumph, riding through streets lined with cheering crowds. The monarchy was restored, the House of Lords was reinstated, and the Anglican Church regained its preeminent position. On the surface, it seemed as though the entire revolution had been erased.
But the restoration was a pragmatic compromise, not a complete rewind. Crucially, the foundational legislation passed by the early Long Parliament in 1641, which abolished the prerogative courts like the Star Chamber and outlawed non-parliamentary taxation like ship money, remained firmly on the books. The monarch's absolute power had been structurally clipped.
The sources detail how the new regime carefully managed the transition with the Indemnity and Oblivion Act. This act essentially granted a general pardon for crimes committed during the Civil Wars, legally demanding that the violence of the past 2 decades be forgotten to allow the nation to heal. However, there was one major, highly specific exception: the regicides.
The men directly involved in signing the death warrant of Charles I were aggressively hunted down. Those still living in England were tried and executed via hanging, drawing, and quartering.
In a gruesome, highly symbolic display of restored royal power, the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw were dug up from their graves in Westminster Abbey, posthumously executed by hanging at Tyburn, and their heads were displayed on spikes outside Westminster Hall for decades.
It is a dark coda to the era, and as we conclude, we must also look at the massive human cost of these conflicts. The demographic toll was staggering. The sources estimate that roughly 200,000 English soldiers and civilians were killed by battles, starvation, and the rampant disease spread by marching armies.
To put this in perspective for you, walk down a street in 1640s England. 1 in every 10 adult men you see will be dead in a few years. Whole towns are wiped off the map by sieges. Castles were slighted and destroyed. When we say civil war, we often picture polite political debates and a few localized battlefield skirmishes. This was a demographic apocalypse. When adjusted for the population of the time, the loss of life suffered in the British Isles between 1642 and 1651 was proportionately comparable to the losses suffered by the nation in the trenches of the First World War.
Yet, despite the return of the king and that horrific demographic cost, the political landscape had fundamentally shifted. The underlying mechanics of power were forever changed. Charles II and his brother James II would eventually try to push the boundaries of royal authority again, but they would find the ground much harder, leading to the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
The Civil Wars proved conclusively through violence that the monarch could not rule without the support of the political nation represented in Parliament. Parliament had proven that it was the ultimate seat of power. They possessed the logistical ability to raise massive taxation, the organizational capacity to wage total war, and the legal audacity to remove a king. The concept of absolute divine right monarchy was dead in England. The events of this decade set the stage for the modern constitutional monarchy where Parliament is sovereign.
The wars forced society to ask fundamental questions about the nature of liberty, authority, property, and consent that simply could not be unasked once they were spoken aloud at places like Putney.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder long after we finish here today. We talked heavily about the levelers and the Putney debates in 1647. Imagine if history had tilted just slightly. If the radical demands of the levelers' universal male suffrage, equality before the law, written constitutions, and total religious freedom had been fully adopted by the army and implemented in the mid-17th century, how fundamentally different would the trajectory of the entire modern world, including the subsequent American Revolution over a century later, have been?
It is a profound historical what-if that underscores just how revolutionary the ideas forged in this decade truly were.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.